Thank you, Daniel. Thank you for inviting me. So thank you, everybody, for being here and online. So yes, I'm going to give a presentation about this latest publication that is titled Strategic Planning for Degrowth. What, who, and how, that's the subtitle. And in this publication, I basically move a step further within the degrowth debate. So in this presentation as well, I will not give you the usual introduction of why degrowth is important, what it is, what it means, and what is the difference between green growth and degrowth, etc., etc. I think it's time to move further and to actually deal with the question of how we get to degrowth. And that's why I try to intervene in the debate on which strategies are best suitable to deal with a degrowth transition. Okay. Now, yes. Now, to do this, to address the strategy of degrowth, however, I would like to give a working definition. Okay, so I'm not going to explain you why this definition in particular, but this is how I can summarize in a nutshell the many definitions of degrowth that are out there. Degrowth is a socio-ecological transition that does two things at the same time. First of all, focused on a planned downscaling or reduction of all those activities that are environmentally harmful and socially alienating, starting from those that are considered as less necessary for the well-being of humans and the environment. Okay? The less necessary is a key word within the degrowth debate. And in fact, one of the most common examples that are given in this case is that of private jets or SUVs, advertisement, fast fashion, etc., etc. Now, a reduction is essential, and that's what distinguishes degrowth from, for example, views of green growth. However, degrowth also clearly say that this reduction is to be coupled with a planned increase of all the activities that regenerate the ecosystem and improve social well-being, starting from the fulfilling of basic needs. Here again, it's very important to stress this aspect, that degrowth focuses on the fulfilling of basic needs for everybody in the world. And in fact, if we take these two definitions together, we could define degrowth as a politics of a transition of more for many in the world and less for the few, the elite that have excess wealth. So this is in a nutshell what in practice degrowth would mean. Now, it's easier said than done, obviously, but we are there, let's say. Now, if you look at the literature on degrowth, you might realize that despite this radical proposal of reducing consumption and production, particularly less necessary forms of consumption and production, degrowth actually has many policy tools available out there. There is a whole iceberg, using the word of Fitzpatrick, of measures, policy measures, tools, subsidies, taxations, funding, and et cetera, that would fit this idea of degrowth. Universal basic income is perhaps the tip of the iceberg. But for example, this is the promotion of energy communities or energy cooperative could be, it's somewhere there in this image as well. So in fact, we could say that degrowth does have a lot of policies out there, but it doesn't have the popular support for a degrowth agenda. Okay, so what we miss is the popular support to actually create and implement a degrowth agenda. Because that degrowth agenda, hypothetical degrowth agenda, would have to basically exist within what we understand as the hegemony of growth. Now, if we understand, therefore, degrowth as a counter-hegemonic project, we understand it as a much more multi-layered and deep, basically, transition to a social and ecological societal socially just and ecological social system. Now, I'm not going to go into the definition of what hegemony is, starting from Gramsci onward, but if we take the work on hegemony, we know that hegemony basically is an overlapping of a system of values, ideological values, which are understood as relevant in society, that reflects also a particular block of powerful actors that pursue those values, and that also reflect an institutional system that is geared to protect the interest of this block of actors. That's what hegemony is. It's basically a transversal overlapping of different layers of ideology, which structure our society. It's not only in our head as a form of values or ideas, but it's also out there as a form of institutions, regulations, procedures, financial schemes that sustain those values. Okay. So if we take degrowth and we understand it as a counter-hegemonic project, we're basically also dealing with these different layers of hegemony. Counter-hegemonic project of degrowth will mean that we have a new system of values that becomes central in society or in the way we organize social relations. These values could be, for example, care, sufficiency, conviviality, posthumanism, feminism, etc., etc. These are values of degrowth that are already out there clearly in the literature. However, these values also must translate into a new block of powerful actors. So from corporate capitalism or platform capitalism to, for example, renewed role of public authorities, the state, and the form of what we might know as public common partnerships. Okay, this is also from the literature. And finally, if we take degrowth as a counter-hegemonic project, we understand it also as an apparatus of new institutions and regulations that nurture those values and enable those new block of actors to gain power. This means regulations such like caps or moratoria, limit to excess, minimum income, universal basic services, public health care, slow mobility, and so on and so forth. Okay. Renewable energy, of course. All these things are, in fact, reflecting a new politics of degrowth, which reflects a new hegemony. Hegemony, in the Gramscian terms, is not understood as something negative. It's just, the process of constructing a new system of social values in society. Now, the literature on degrowth that has dealt with the pathway to get to a new hegemony of degrowth, or to make degrowth a counter-hegemonic project, as they debated a lot on issue of strategies. In fact, the discussion of strategies has been going on within the degrowth community for 10 years. Recently, this book called Degrowth and Strategies is trying to collect different contributions that think about this issue of how to get there. The argument of this book, and many of the authors within this book, is that degrowth is many things at the same time, cannot be pinpointed to one political view. Therefore, the strategy is that of what they define as strategic indeterminacy or flexible pluralism. These are terms that they use to explain how degrowth can become more popular. In fact, they also built on Ellicott and Wright framework of real utopias that basically says that the post-capitalist transition requires many different strategies. Some are more disruptive, what he calls ruptural. Some are more conformative. These are what he calls more symbiotic with existing institutions. And some are more interstitial, so practices of prefiguration that experiment with the future. Okay, they use a different palette of strategies. And basically, the idea is that we should find a way to construct a new movement of degrowth that is international and connects all of them. Now, this is the argument. I find it not enough. I find it not enough because it gives me the idea that degrowth is a bit of everywhere, it's a bit of everything, and we still don't know how to do this, in fact. So we need to unpack the strategic problem step by step in order to indeed define a better strategy, political strategy for a degrowth counter-hegemonic project. So that's what I did in my work. I basically started from the basics. I asked myself, what is the strategic problem of degrowth at the moment? And in my view, a strategic problem has three sub-questions. The first is, what is the goal that distinguishes degrowth from other movements? Second, what are the actors that degrowth thinks are the leading agents of the transition? And third, what is the expected trajectory of change? Okay, these are three different assumptions that together make what I call a degrowth-based planning theory of socio-ecological change. That's what we need, a new theory of socio-ecological change, or theory of change for degrowth, if you want to call it that way. Now, let's start with the first, the depths, which is the what of degrowth. What is the goal of degrowth? Now, if you look at how degrowth framed the critique of current society, we see that it's clearly an anti-capitalist or a post-capitalist project. That's no doubt. It's very hard to assume that degrowth it's not anti-capitalist when capitalism is a system that by default needs growth, okay, to exist. Now, however, despite the fact that it's anti-capitalist, it's clearly different from what we understand as left eco-modernism. So approaches to post-capitalist transitions that primarily focus on the socialization of the means of production and focus exclusively and primarily on material human needs. In this approach would, of course, clearly point at trade unions and workers as the agents of the transition. And this is clearly what Matt Huber does in his book, Climate Change as Class War. By the way, a book that has a lot of fun about degrowth in a way that in my view was exaggerated, but I think it was misplaced humor. Well, I was good to sell this case, was good to make that argument against degrowth. This is clearly a left eco-modernist, and I'm not going to go too long on why, but there are all kinds of debates online you can find on the critique to this left eco-modernist. In fact, degrowth focuses primarily on satiation. That's my argument. So it's not about just the socialization of production. That would be not enough. We need to basically establish a system of values that are able to satisfy all the essential needs within a particular territory. And in order to in fact liberate that territory from the obligation to pursue economic growth. That's the key, basically, to satisfy need and reduce the obligation, the compulsion to grow. That's what Marx terms this term, the mute compulsion to grow. So satiation basically is a principle of social organization, which, as I said before, is also instituted into regulations and new block of power. Now, if you take satiation to look at the quality of a country like the Netherlands, one of the, by the way, the richest in the world, you see that in urban areas in particular, we have the highest share of poverty, and we see an increasing division between rich and poor, increasing homelessness, increasing energy poverty, increasing food poverty. We clearly see that the growth of the country does not deliver in terms of fulfilling of essential needs. And that would be indeed the target of the growth, at least the primary one. The second aspect that I introduced is that of agency. So the actors that degrowth consider as, let's say, the leading actors in a transition. Now, if you look at the existing literature on degrowth, we see two main arguments here, roughly speaking. The first, it's a celebration of the power of prefigurative practices that have energy co-ops or urban gardens, low mobility, housing co-ops, etc., etc. The idea is that these practices are the agents of the future. Now, this view, another view of the agency of degrowth is that of more like, what is being defined by this paper of Durant, cybernetic degrowth. The idea that the state can organize a form of planned degrowth where each level has a certain degree of democracy. Now, both these views for me are also a bit not enough to explain the trajectory, because as I will explain later, for the second one, we still do not have solved the problem of legitimacy of the state. So the state will never do something like that. They will never start tomorrow, and we see it everywhere. And the other, we still cannot explain how come that we have plenty of degrowth practices everywhere out there, but capitalism is going up and running, and it's going very well. So they exist or they coexist with economic growth. So these two views are not sufficient. And so when I think about agency in the postmodern tradition, I always go back to Michael Hart and Antonio Negri, two critical scholars that have theorized a bit agency, in my view. at the time of what they call biopolitical production, basically production of ideas, knowledge, data, etc., etc. And in their work, they explain very well that the counter-hegemonic power, the agency, it's built on practices that do two things. On the one hand, they are creative of new social institutions. So yes, they are prefigurative, but at the same time, they're also oppositional. They also mobilize against existing institutions. Okay, so these are practices in the degrowth sense that would perform satiation, reduction, but also be oppositional. That's for me extremely important. By the way, the book is 500 pages long, but there are 4 keywords at one point that summarize the whole book. That is, the public is dissolved. That means there is no such a thing as one agent out there that is tomorrow going to trigger the process. And there's no such a thing as one constituency of degrowth, like one group, like the workers of the factory A or B. There are many more. I think this is a very important lesson also for neo-Marxist scholarship that sometimes forget about these particular types of works. Now, the third aspect I introduced was that of trajectory. So what is the trajectory that we think would work to reach a new hegemony of growth? Now, here the issue is very tricky because, in fact, if we take an hegemonic perspective on degrowth, or if we take ideology as the key problem, ideology is everywhere, right? So the question comes, how do we change an ideology and its institutions when the agents of that change are part of that ideology? They operate within that ideology. As you know, nobody is outside of ideologies. This is what Louis Toussaint already said many years ago. And also, if you take cooperatives, energy cooperatives, they also operate within the established system that is created within the economic growth ideology. So, but they obviously tweak it. So the issue is, again, that of what in Italian we say the chicken and the egg. So basically, if the agency of transformation is within ideology, how do we trigger this process, right? In order to answer that question, I use the work of Meissner, a cultural sociologist, and building on works of Stuart Hall and colleagues. She says that when we look at how cultural and ideology changes, we see 3 different processes happening more or less at the same time. The first is that of prefiguration. And that's clearly important for degrowth. Basically, we need to do degrowth today in the present. Like energy cooperatives, again, we need to do it in the present today because they perform those values. However, that is not enough. We need to also enable these values of association to become a desired state widely. We need to make them popular. Some people told me once, oh, you are claiming we need a degrowth influencer. Yes, I want a degrowth influencer. Okay, that's what I want. I would like to have many degrowth influencers. Obviously, that's not the only way to make popular things. You can use festivals, campaigns, and you can also use architectures. You can think creatively and art clearly, culture in general. And finally, a third process that happens is that there is always a relation to pressure movement. So prefiguration, popularization always basically translate into movements that contest key powers, particularly the corporate and powers that govern our society today. And these are clearly the socio-ecological movements that claim satiation, translated as phasing out fossil, phasing out aviation, phasing out fracking, phasing out GMOs, and so on and so forth. Okay, the movements that claim for this are extremely important. So these 3 things, I think, give an idea of how prefiguration, which is a mantra for degrowth, translates into a movement that pressure institutions and uses the popularization as its own backup. Okay. In sum, this process, it's what changes practices from being alternatives, like a degrowth alternative, to oppositional, or to use the word of Joe Dedin, another political philosopher, to move from political actions to political power, because after all, that's what we're talking about. Okay, Or to use again the words of a famous cultural scholar, Raymond Williams, he says there is a simple theoretical distinction between alternative and opposition. That is to say, between someone who simply finds a different way to live and wishes to be left alone with it, and someone who finds a different way to live and wants to change the society in its light. There is something very different between an energy cooperative that self-provides energy in a neighborhood of the city and an energy cooperative that builds a movement with other cooperatives to finally, substitute energy provision. I'm using the word of energy cooperative because Daniel and I, we've been recently writing about this, and I think there are people working on this here. So I could also talk about housing cooperatives, but let's keep it on energy for today. Now, in my paper, I argue that a strategic spatial planning theory, which is a subfield of my own research field, that of spatial planning, can actually provide the conceptual toolkit to build a social spatial vision of this degrowth transition, building obviously on these arguments that are made so far. Now, this is mostly an argument I made for planners, spatial planners themselves, telling them, guys, you've been working from a green growth perspective for too long. We need to use the tools that we have made to actually work for a degrowth perspective. That's my call for my colleagues, okay? And therefore, I started to go back into the tradition of strategic spatial planning theory and tried to see why, or explain why it was important for me to reread that kind of work in order to build a theory of degrowth transition. Now, if this might be a literature that is not familiar to all of you, but in some, that literature, which started in the early 90s, basically was saying that the economic development of cities and regions had several problems at the turn around the late 80s, early 90s. First of all, the role of the state was weakened. The state didn't have capacity to implement their policies, also when they were socially redistributed. There were cuts to the state. It was the beginning of deep neoliberalism. At the same time, many regions of the world were suffering deep poverty because of deindustrialization. So there was an urgency to provide essential services and also spatial qualities, including green, by the way, and good air quality. At the same time, these planners were also had to cope with aggressive capital investments in cities. I mean aggressive because, in fact, we had a huge amount of global investors, turning into real estate, redeveloping major areas of the cities, deindustrializing particularly in Europe, and indeed buying out a lot of assets, public assets. So it was quite an aggressive form of development. And also at that time, they had to cope with the problem of lack of popular consensus, just as the degrowth today. In fact, if you would ask to Amsterdam shipbuilding workers, would you like to redevelop your neighborhoods into a new economy? They would say, no, I want my shipbuilding industry because this is the work I've been doing for years. In fact, for 10 years, we had all kind of workers' unions rejecting plans of transformations. Okay, so the planners had to deal with this problem. I think they're very similar to the one that degrowth is dealing with today. However, of course, these works, they did not care about reduction. In fact, what happened then is that they got into the green growth agenda and they massively invested in that direction. There was no discussion of degrowth or reduction whatsoever. It was also the 90s. Now, if we look at the literature, there are two processes that this literature says can help forming a counter-hegemonic project. And these two processes are both spatially, of course, defined. The first one is what I call synergy. Basically, they say that basically the argument here is that we need to establish networks of mutual aid between different practices that perform reduction and satiation. And these networks need to be embedded into particular institutions with the aim of gaining power of influence. Okay, power of influence is very important here. I can give example of this, but I'm going too long. I'm going to focus on the second one. We can discuss about it. The second one is that of regionalization. And this is, I think, something that is it's quite missing in the degrowth scholarship today, also because planners were quite silent in this debate, so it's not there. Regionalization means that the synergy process need to be done within a particular territory. We need this territorial dimension of degrowth in order to make degrowth tangible and politically viable. So, and also to make visible the social and spatial costs of growth on the everyday life of people. If you look at the territories of degrowth today, we see the debate somehow divided into two ways to deal with space. On the one hand, we have this small space of prefiguration, the energy cooperative, the housing cooperative, the urban garden, the agroecology, the urban park, the whatever, you name it. These are micro spaces of politics. On the other hand, a lot of the economics literature on degrowth always hammers on the discussion between, inequality at the global level. We have global north, global south. This image is quite known. We have a very rich, affluent society that consumes the large majority of resources, et cetera, et cetera. These two are both, in my view, not enough, because the region is what I argue fills the gap between these two. Now, to give you an example, again, if we look at the housing co-op in Amsterdam, we might even think this is not radical enough. It's a bunch of relatively privileged people within a global north country, very rich. They make a cooperative and they get affordable housing, right? They're great. I love housing cooperatives, but they're not necessarily oppositional. If you look at the other image, you might ask yourself, like Max Huber does, why people would actually go on the street to protect, I don't know, producers of cocoa or banana in South America. He says, no, people go on the street because it's their own material interest that moves them. Okay, so it's because they suffer, not necessarily because they want to help the South Americans. I'm talking about South America just to take an example here. So I think there we need to find a space that is large enough to have a relevant or powerful movement, but it's also small enough to make the contradictions of growth tangible. And that's what the region is. And I mean, my idea of the region comes also from the study of social movements. This quote is taken from a publication that the movement called Les Soulèvements de la Terre has published recently, where they learn about their own practice. Now, you know the Soulèvements de la Terre. It's one of the most, I would say, radical and powerful socio-ecological movements in Europe today. And what they say is that their argument is that if different struggles and practices, including prefiguration, manage to compose together, they use the word compose, it is first and foremost because of the same strategic assessment of common field of action, which is the need to join the struggles against, for example, the grabbing of land and water by the agro-industrial system with those against the voracity of the metropolises that pour continuous flow of concrete into our world. So basically what they say is that the reason why the movement grows is that we have agroecological movements protesting for water quality, water safety, food safety, joining movement against the urban sprawl and the aviation, the increase of airports. This movement joined together within a region, the region that shares this, okay? That's why I think regionalization of the growth is very important. Now, so far I've been talking about concepts. I want to give you an example of what I mean. Now, you probably already know the story of the doughnut strategy in Amsterdam. I mean, if you don't know it, I mean, it's everywhere. At one point, I was seeing doughnuts in my dreams everywhere. And it's been written in many forms everywhere, and it's far from successful. So I will reflect critically on it at the end. But however, while it was unsuccessful, I think it gives us an idea of how, at one point, the city of Amsterdam decided to build a new popular consent around a different vision of the city. In fact, in Amsterdam around 2008, the city wanted to make popular, to advocate for a new understanding of the well-being and prosperity of the city within ecological boundaries, clearly a post-growth argument. However, they had to do it with the lack of consensus. I mean, we were coming out of a liberal government, and it was important to reestablish the consensus around this idea in Amsterdam. And what they did was to use a new framing of place, mobilizing symbols, public experts like Kay Raworth. So in fact, it was an ideological work, what they were doing, before being a technical work. And what did they do? This is similar to any type of transition of building consensus, popular pressure, etc. What did they do? They did many things. They did, first of all, city sponsoring. They sponsored visionary workshops, so-called city portraits. People were discussing about what the doughnut would mean for the city of Amsterdam. They also embedded literally this process within local prefigurative practices. They had what they call doughnut deals, so basically agreements between institutions and citizen-led practices about, in this case, circular reuse and in the frame of addressing poverty. They also made this process complementary to the building of a new regional strategy for the future. They are so-called omgevingvisie, a new long-term vision. They also campaigned a lot to make it popular through, in fact, agencies like DEAL, which is funded by Kay Raworth, by the way. And also, they established coalitions of different actors behind this vision, which was the so-called doughnut coalition. And in fact, a student of mine has just reviewed the doughnut coalition, and she summarized all the different practices that were under it, or were, kind of recognizing themselves as part of this doughnut coalition. And you see here, there are 5 different major categories, and you have cooperatives all over. You have farming, you have culture, education, you have services for elderly, for children, a bit of everything, I mean, the point is, this coalition was symbolic, again, but it was in order to create popularization within the city for this doughnut strategy. So all these things were done together. And I think it was pretty well done. Now, unfortunately, this doughnut trajectory is quickly dying in Amsterdam now. The government changed, and now it's not keeping momentum. And the reason, in my view, there are many, but first of all, there are some clear limitations from the point of view of degrowth. First of all, was not really a regional thing, was more a city thing. They focused really on the inner part of the city. They deliberately excluded debates about the airport, about logistic services. Here you see the logistic development around Amsterdam, the harbor, the seed industry, the flower industry, which is crazy. So, I mean, all these major environmentally polluting industries in Amsterdam were out of the debate. Okay, this major limitation. Also, they misunderstood somehow the doughnut as circular economy, which was a way to, sneak in the idea of post-growth within the established frameworks of circular economy that was already existing there. And the result is that, in fact, if we look at the numbers, Amsterdam is not reducing its footprint, and it's becoming more poor. Oh wait, it's becoming richer, but poor people are increasing. In fact, the process was not successful from a degrowth perspective. I want to be clear, but I think what we can learn is from the steps that were made, because they reached a degree of popular support, high degree. So in conclusion, just to wrap up, I think we in degrowth scholarship, say we, I hope you also, if you want, we should start focusing on regional networks within the degrowth discussions on strategy. So not single examples, but more how different examples of satiation, reduction, prefiguration connect together. That's the next step. We should, in fact, look at how this practice, if and how these practices tackle vested interests, so if they're really oppositional or if they coexist, so if they really substitute the existing form of service provision, let's put it this way. We also should think in terms of a territorial spatial vision of degrowth that addresses both the social impacts of in time, but also the material aspect of provisioning essential services. And now here a message for planners, spatial planners. I think that we have an important role to play there, because first of all, we can, advocate for satiation in light of the worsening climate and biodiversity crisis and social crisis in which we are. We could establish alliances and indeed think in terms of taking, of gaining power to define new institutional frameworks. Now, this debate, obviously, it's something very delicate also because it also calls for a debate about the organization of the degrowth movement and the role of particular types of groups within it. If we assume there are planners that are orchestrators of degrowth, we might think that the horizontalism might not be necessarily the only alternative. Horizontalism of movements, like where everybody is equal. Maybe we might think about more different approaches to organize movement. But this is a matter of debate within the movement of degrowth and beyond, and we can pick it up today here. So thank you for listening.